Chapter 9. When Elizabeth Jane opened the hinged casement next morning, the mellow air brought in the feel of imminent autumn almost as distinctly as if she had been in the remotest hamlet. Casterbridge was the complement of the rural life around, not its urban opposite. Bees and butterflies in the cornfields at the top of the town, who desired to get to the meads at the bottom, took no circuitous course, but flew straight down High Street without any apparent consciousness that they were traversing strange latitudes. And in autumn airy spheres of thistledown floated into the same street, lodged upon the shop fronts, blew into drains, and innumerable tawny and yellow leaves skimmed along the pavement, and stole through people's doorways into their passages, with a hesitating scratch on the floor, like the skirts of timid visitors. Hearing voices, one of which was close at hand, she withdrew her head and glanced from behind the window curtains. Mr. Henchard, now habited no longer as a great personage, but as a thriving man of business, was pausing on his way up the middle of the street, and the Scotchman was looking from the window adjoining her own. Henchard, it appeared, had gone a little way past the inn before he had noticed his acquaintance of the previous evening. He came back a few steps, Donald Farfrae opening the window further. "And you are off soon, I suppose?" said Henchard upwards. "Yes, almost this moment, sir," said the other. "Maybe I'll walk on till the coach makes up on me." "Which way?" "The way ye are going." "Then shall we walk together to the top of town?" "If you'll wait a minute," said the Scotchman. In a few minutes the latter emerged, bag in hand. Henchard looked at the bag as at an enemy. It showed there was no mistake about the young man's departure. "Ah, my lad," he said, "you should have been a wise man, and have stayed with me." "Yes, yes, it might have been wiser," said Donald, looking microscopically at the houses that were furthest off. "It is only telling you the truth when I say my plans are vague." They had by this time passed on from the precincts of the inn, and Elizabeth Jane heard no more. She saw that they continued in conversation, Henchard turning to the other occasionally, and emphasizing some remark with a gesture. Thus they passed the King's Arms Hotel, the Market House, St. Peter's churchyard wall, ascending to the upper end of the long street till they were small as 2 grains of corn, when they bent suddenly to the right into the Bristol Road and were out of view. "He was a good man, and he's gone," she said to herself. "I was nothing to him, and there was no reason why he should have wished me good-bye." The simple thought, with its latent sense of slight, had moulded itself out of the following little fact. When the Scotchman came out at the door he had by accident glanced up at her, and then he had looked away again without nodding or smiling or saying a word. "You are still thinking, mother," she said when she turned inwards. "Yes, I am thinking of Mr. Henchard's sudden liking for that young man. He was always so. Now surely if he takes so warmly to people who are not related to him at all, may he not take as warmly to his own kin?" While they debated this question, a procession of 5 large wagons went past, laden with hay up to the bedroom windows. They came in from the country, and the steaming horses had probably been travelling a great part of the night. To the shaft of each hung a little board, on which was painted in white letters, "Henchard, corn factor and hay merchant." The spectacle renewed his wife's conviction that, for her daughter's sake, she should strain a point to rejoin him. The discussion was continued during breakfast, and the end of it was that Mrs. Henchard decided, for good or for ill, to send Elizabeth Jane with a message to Henchard to the effect that his relative Susan, a sailor's widow, was in the town, leaving it to him to say whether or not he would recognize her. What had brought her to this determination were chiefly 2 things. He had been described as a lonely widower, and he had expressed shame for a past transaction of his life. There was promise in both. "If he says no," she enjoined, as Elizabeth Jane stood, bonnet on, ready to depart, "if he thinks it does not become the good position he has reached to in the town, to own, to let us call on him as his distant kinfolk, say, then, sir, we would rather not intrude. We will leave Casterbridge as quietly as we have come, and go back to our own country. I almost feel that I would rather he did say so, as I have not seen him for so many years, and we are so little allied to him." "And if he say yes?" inquired the more sanguine one. "In that case," answered Mrs. Henchard cautiously, "ask him to write me a note saying when and how he will see us, or me." Elizabeth Jane went a few steps towards the landing. "And tell him," continued her mother, "that I fully know I have no claim upon him, that I am glad to find he is thriving, that I hope his life may be long and happy. There, go." Thus, with a half-hearted willingness, a smothered reluctance, did the poor forgiving woman start her unconscious daughter on this errand. It was about 10 o'clock, and market day, when Elizabeth paced up the High Street in no great hurry, for to herself her position was only that of a poor relation deputed to hunt up a rich one. The front doors of the private houses were mostly left open at this warm autumn time. No thought of umbrella stealers disturbing the minds of the placid burgesses. Hence, through the long straight entrance, passages thus unclosed could be seen, as through tunnels. The mossy gardens at the back, glowing with nasturtiums, fuchsias, scarlet geraniums, bloody warriors, snapdragons, and dahlias, this floral blaze being backed by crusted grey stonework remaining from a yet remoter Casterbridge than the venerable one visible in the street. The old-fashioned fronts of these houses, which had older than old-fashioned backs, rose sheer from the pavement, into which the bow windows protruded like bastions, necessitating a pleasant chassé-déchassé movement to the time-pressed pedestrian at every few yards. He was bound also to evolve other terpsichorean figures in respect of doorsteps, scrapers, cellar hatches, church buttresses, and the overhanging angles of walls, which originally unobtrusive had become bow-legged and knock-kneed. In addition to these fixed obstacles, which spoke so cheerfully of individual unrestraint as to boundaries, movables occupied the path and roadway to a perplexing extent. First, the vans of the carriers in and out of Casterbridge, who hailed from Mellstock, Weatherbury, the Hintocks, Sherton Abbas, Kingsbere, Overcombe, and many other towns and villages round. Their owners were numerous enough to be regarded as a tribe, and had almost distinctiveness enough to be regarded as a race. Their vans had just arrived, and were drawn up on each side of the street in close file, so as to form at places a wall between the pavement and the roadway. Moreover, every shop pitched out half its contents upon trestles and boxes on the curb, extending the display each week a little further and further into the roadway, despite the expostulations of the two feeble old constables, until there remained but a tortuous defile for carriages down the centre of the street, which afforded fine opportunities for skill with the reins. Over the pavement on the sunny side of the way hung shop blinds so constructed as to give the passenger's hat a smart buffet off his head, as from the unseen hands of Cranston's goblin page, celebrated in romantic lore. Horses for sale were tied in rows, their forelegs on the pavement, their hind legs in the street, in which position they occasionally nipped little boys by the shoulder who were passing to school. And any inviting recess in front of a house that had been modestly kept back from the general line was utilized by pig dealers as a pen for their stock. The yeomen, farmers, dairymen, and townsfolk who came to transact business in these ancient streets spoke in other ways than by articulation. Not to hear the words of your interlocutor in metropolitan centres is to know nothing of his meaning. Here the face, the arms, the hat, the stick, the body throughout spoke equally with the tongue. To express satisfaction, the Casterbridge market-man added to his utterance a broadening of the cheeks, a crevicing of the eyes, a throwing back of the shoulders, which was intelligible from the other end of the street. If he wondered, though all Henchard's carts and wagons were rattling past him, you knew it from perceiving the inside of his crimson mouth, and a target-like circling of his eyes. Deliberation caused sundry attacks on the moss of adjoining walls with the end of his stick. A change of his hat from the horizontal to the less so, a sense of tediousness announced itself in a lowering of the person by spreading the knees to a lozenge-shaped aperture and contorting the arms. Chicanery, subterfuge had hardly a place in the streets of this honest borough to all appearance, and it was said that the lawyers in the court-house hard by occasionally threw in strong arguments for the other side out of pure generosity, though apparently by mischance, when advancing their own. Thus Casterbridge was in most respects but the pole, focus, or nerve-knot of the surrounding country life, differing from the many manufacturing towns, which are as foreign bodies set down, like boulders on a plain, in a green world with which they have nothing in common. Casterbridge lived by agriculture, at one remove further from the fountainhead than the adjoining villages, no more. The townsfolk understood every fluctuation in the rustic's condition, for it affected their receipts as much as the labourers. They entered into the troubles and joys which moved the aristocratic families 10 miles round for the same reason, and even at the dinner parties of the professional families the subjects of discussion were corn, cattle disease, sowing and reaping, fencing and planting, while politics were viewed by them less from their own standpoint of burgesses with rights and privileges than from the standpoint of their country neighbours. All the venerable contrivances and confusions which delighted the eye by their quaintness and in a measure reasonableness in this rare old market town were metropolitan novelties to the unpractised eyes of Elizabeth Jane, fresh from netting fish seines in a seaside cottage. Very little inquiry was necessary to guide her footsteps. Henchard's house was one of the best, faced with dull red and grey old brick. The front door was open, and, as in other houses, she could see through the passage to the end of the garden, nearly a quarter of a mile off. Mr. Henchard was not in the house, but in the store-yard. She was conducted into the mossy garden and through a door in the wall, which was studded with rusty nails, speaking of generations of fruit trees that had been trained there. The door opened upon the yard, and here she was left to find him as she could. It was a place flanked by hay barns, into which tons of fodder, all in trusses, were being packed from the wagons she had seen pass the inn that morning. On other sides of the yard were wooden granaries on stone staddles, to which access was given by Flemish ladders, and a storehouse several floors high. Wherever the doors of these places were open, a closely packed throng of bursting wheat sacks could be seen standing inside, with the air of awaiting a famine that would not come. She wandered about this place, uncomfortably conscious of the impending interview, till she was quite weary of searching. She ventured to inquire of a boy in what quarter Mr. Henchard could be found. He directed her to an office which she had not seen before, and knocking at the door she was answered by a cry of "Come in!" Elizabeth turned the handle, and there stood before her, bending over some sample bags on a table, not the corn merchant, but the young Scotchman, Mr. Farfrae, in the act of pouring some grains of wheat from one hand to the other. His hat hung on a peg behind him, and the roses of his carpet-bag glowed from the corner of the room. Having toned her feelings and arranged words on her lips for Mr. Henchard, and for him alone, she was for the moment confounded. "Yes, what is it?" said the Scotchman, like a man who permanently ruled there. She said she wanted to see Mr. Henchard. "Ah, yes. Will you wait a minute? He's engaged just now," said the young man, apparently not recognizing her as the girl at the inn. He handed her a chair, bade her sit down, and turned to his sample bags again. While Elizabeth Jane sits waiting in great amaze at the young man's presence, we may briefly explain how he came there. When the two new acquaintances had passed out of sight that morning towards the Bath and Bristol road, they went on silently, except for a few commonplaces, till they had gone down an avenue on the town walls called the Chalk Walk, leading to an angle where the north and west escarpments met. From this high corner of the square earthworks a vast extent of country could be seen. A footpath ran steeply down the green slope, conducting from the shady promenade on the walls to a road at the bottom of the scarp. It was by this path the Scotchman had to descend. "Well, here's success to 'ee," said Henchard, holding out his right hand and leaning with his left upon the wicket which protected the descent. In the act there was the inelegance of one whose feelings are nipped and wishes defeated. "I shall often think of this time, and of how you came at the very moment to throw a light upon my difficulty." Still holding the young man's hand, he paused, and then added deliberately, "Now I am not the man to let a cause be lost for want of a word, and before ye are gone for ever I'll speak. Once more, will ye stay? There it is, flat and plain. You can see that it isn't all selfishness that makes me press 'ee, for my business is not quite so scientific as to require an intellect entirely out of the common. Others would do for the place, without doubt, Some selfishness, perhaps, there is, but there is more. It isn't for me to repeat what. Come bide with me, and name your own terms. I'll agree to 'em willingly, and without a word of gainsaying, for hang it, Farfrae, I like thee well." The young man's hand remained steady in Henchard's for a moment or two. He looked over the fertile country that stretched beneath them, then backward along the shaded walk reaching to the top of the town. His face flushed. "I never expected this, I did not," he said. "It's Providence. Should anyone go against it? No, I'll not go to America. I'll stay and be your man." His hand, which had lain lifeless in Henchard's, returned the latter's grasp. "Done," said Henchard. "Done," said Donald Farfrae. The face of Mr. Henchard beamed forth a satisfaction that was almost fierce in its strength. "Now you are my friend," he exclaimed. "Come back to my house. Let's clinch it at once by clear terms, so as to be comfortable in our minds." Farfrae caught up his bag and retraced the northwest avenue in Henchard's company as he had come. Henchard was all confidence now. "I am the most distant fellow in the world when I don't care for a man," he said. "But when a man takes my fancy he takes it strong. Now I am sure you can eat another breakfast. You couldn't have eaten much so early, even if they had anything at that place to give 'ee, which they hadn't. So come to my house, and we will have a solid, staunch tuck-in, and settle terms in black and white if you like, though my word's my bond. I can always make a good meal in the morning. I've got a splendid cold pigeon pie going just now. You can have some home brewed if you want to, you know." "It is too early in the morning for that," said Farfrae with a smile. "Well, of course, I didn't know. I don't drink it because of my oath, but I am obliged to brew for my work people." Thus talking, they returned and entered Henchard's premises by the back way, or traffic entrance. Here the matter was settled over the breakfast, at which Henchard heaped the young Scotchman's plate to a prodigal fullness. He would not rest satisfied till Farfrae had written for his luggage from Bristol and dispatched the letter to the post office. When it was done, this man of strong impulses declared that his new friend should take up his abode in his house, at least till some suitable lodgings could be found. He then took Farfrae round and showed him the place, and the stores of grain and other stock, and finally entered the offices, where the younger of them has already been discovered by Elizabeth. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. While she still sat under the Scotchman's eyes, a man came up to the door, reaching it as Henchard opened the door of the inner office to admit Elizabeth. The newcomer stepped forward like the quicker cripple at Bethesda, and entered in her stead. She could hear his words to Henchard. "Joshua Jopp, sir, by appointment, the new manager." "The new manager? He's in his office," said Henchard bluntly. "In his office?" said the man with a stultified air. "I mentioned Thursday," said Henchard, "and as you did not keep your appointment I have engaged another manager. At first I thought he must be you. Do you think I can wait when business is in question?" "You said Thursday or Saturday, sir," said the newcomer, pulling out a letter. "Well, you are too late," said the corn factor. "I can say no more." "You as good as engaged me," murmured the man. "Subject to an interview," said Henchard. "I am sorry for you, very sorry indeed, but it can't be helped." There was no more to be said, and the man came out, encountering Elizabeth Jane in his passage. She could see that his mouth twitched with anger, and that bitter disappointment was written in his face everywhere. Elizabeth Jane now entered and stood before the master of the premises. His dark pupils, which always seemed to have a red spark of light in them, though this could hardly be a physical fact, turned indifferently round under his dark brows until they rested on her figure. "Now then, what is it, my young woman?" he said blandly. "Can I speak to you not on business, sir?" said she. "Yes, I suppose." He looked at her more thoughtfully. "I am sent to tell you, sir," she innocently went on, "that a distant relative of yours by marriage, Susan Newson, a sailor's widow, is in the town, and to ask whether you would wish to see her." The rich rouge noir of his countenance underwent a slight change. "Oh, Susan is still alive?" he asked with difficulty. "Yes, sir." "Are you her daughter?" Yes, sir, her only daughter. What do you call yourself? Your Christian name? Elizabeth Jane, sir. Newson? Elizabeth Jane Newson. This at once suggested to Henchard that the transaction of his early married life at Weydon Fair was unrecorded in the family history. It was more than he could have expected. His wife had behaved kindly to him in return for his unkindness, and had never proclaimed her wrong to her child or to the world. "I am a good deal interested in your news," he said, "and as this is not a matter of business but pleasure, suppose we go indoors." It was with a gentle delicacy of manner surprising to Elizabeth that he showed her out of the office and through the outer room, where Donald Farfrae was overhauling bins and samples with the inquiring inspection of a beginner in charge. Henchard preceded her through the door in the wall to the suddenly changed scene of the garden and flowers, and onward into the house. The dining-room, to which he introduced her, still exhibited the remnants of the lavish breakfast laid for Farfrae. It was furnished to profusion with heavy mahogany furniture of the deepest red Spanish hues. Pembroke tables, with leaves hanging so low that they well nigh touched the floor, stood against the walls on legs and feet shaped like those of an elephant, and on one lay 3 huge folio volumes, a family Bible, a Josephus, and a Whole Duty of Man. In the chimney corner was a fire grate with a fluted semicircular back, having urns and festoons cast in relief thereon, and the chairs were of the kind which, since that day, has cast lustre upon the names of Chippendale and Sheraton, though in point of fact their patterns may have been such as those illustrious carpenters never saw or heard of. "Sit down, Elizabeth Jane, sit down," he said, with a shake in his voice as he uttered her name, and sitting down himself he allowed his hands to hang between his knees while he looked upon the carpet. "Your mother, then, is quite well?" "She is rather worn out, sir, with travelling. A sailor's widow. When did he die?" "Father was lost last spring." Henchard winced at the word father thus applied. "Do you and she come from abroad, America or Australia?" he asked. "No, we have been in England some years. I was 12 when we came here from Canada." "Ah, exactly." By such conversation he discovered the circumstances which had enveloped his wife and her child in such total obscurity that he had long ago believed them to be in their graves. These things being clear, he returned to the present. "And where is your mother staying?" "At the Three Mariners." "And you are her daughter, Elizabeth Jane," repeated Henchard. He arose, came close to her, and glanced in her face. "I think," he said suddenly, turning away with a wet eye, "you shall take a note from me to your mother. I should like to see her. She is not left very well off by her late husband?" His eye fell on Elizabeth's clothes, which, though a respectable suit of black and her very best, were decidedly old-fashioned, even to Casterbridge eyes. "Not very well," she said, glad that he had divined this without her being obliged to express it. He sat down at the table and wrote a few lines, next taking from his pocket-book a £5 note, which he put in the envelope with the letter, adding to it, as if by an afterthought, 5 shillings. Sealing the whole up carefully, he directed it to Mrs. Newson, 3 Mariners Inn, and handed the packet to Elizabeth. "Deliver it to her personally, please," said Henchard. "Well, I am glad to see you here, Elizabeth Jane, very glad. We must have a long talk together, but not just now." He took her hand at parting, and held it so warmly that she, who had known so little friendship, was much affected, and tears rose to her aerial grey eyes. The instant that she was gone, Henchard's state showed itself more distinctly. Having shut the door, he sat in his dining-room, stiffly erect, gazing at the opposite wall as if he read his history there. "Begad!" he suddenly exclaimed, jumping up. "I didn't think of that. Perhaps these are impostors, and Susan and the child dead after all." However, a something in Elizabeth Jane soon assured him that, as regarded her at least, there could be little doubt. And a few hours would settle the question of her mother's identity, for he had arranged in his note to see her that evening. "It never rains but it pours," said Henchard. His keenly excited interest in his new friend the Scotchman was now eclipsed by this event, and Donald Farfrae saw so little of him during the rest of the day that he wondered at the suddenness of his employer's moods. In the meantime Elizabeth had reached the inn. Her mother, instead of taking the note with the curiosity of a poor woman expecting assistance, was much moved at sight of it. She did not read it at once, asking Elizabeth to describe her reception and the very words Mr. Henchard used. Elizabeth's back was turned when her mother opened the letter. It ran thus: "Meet me at 8 o'clock this evening, if you can, at the Ring on the Budmouth Road. The place is easy to find. I can say no more now. The news upsets me almost. The girl seems to be in ignorance. Keep her so till I have seen you. M.H." He said nothing about the enclosure of 5 guineas. The amount was significant. It may tacitly have said to her that he bought her back again. She waited restlessly for the close of the day, telling Elizabeth Jane that she was invited to see Mr. Henchard, that she would go alone. But she said nothing to show that the place of meeting was not at his house, nor did she hand the note to Elizabeth. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Ring at Casterbridge was merely the local name of one of the finest Roman amphitheatres, if not the very finest, remaining in Britain. Casterbridge announced old Rome in every street, alley, and precinct. It looked Roman, bespoke the art of Rome, concealed dead men of Rome. It was impossible to dig more than a foot or two deep about the town, fields, and gardens, without coming upon some tall soldier or other of the empire, who had lain there in his silent, unobtrusive rest for a space of 1500 years. He was mostly found lying on his side, in an oval scoop in the chalk, like a chicken in its shell, his knees drawn up to his chest, sometimes with the remains of his spear against his arm, a fibula or brooch of bronze on his breast or forehead, an urn at his knees, a jar at his throat, a bottle at his mouth, and mystified conjecture pouring down upon him from the eyes of Casterbridge street boys and men who had turned a moment to gaze at the familiar spectacle as they passed by. Imaginative inhabitants, who would have felt an unpleasantness at the discovery of a comparatively modern skeleton in their gardens, were quite unmoved by these hoary shapes. They had lived so long ago, their time was so unlike the present, their hopes and motives were so widely removed from ours, that between them and the living there seemed to stretch a gulf too wide for even a spirit to pass. The amphitheatre was a huge circular enclosure with a notch at opposite extremities of its diameter, north and south. From its sloping internal form it might have been called the spittoon of the Jotuns. It was to Casterbridge what the ruined Colosseum is to modern Rome, and was nearly of the same magnitude. The dusk of evening was the proper hour at which a true impression of this suggestive place could be received. Standing in the middle of the arena at that time, there by degrees became apparent its real vastness, which a cursory view from the summit at noonday was apt to obscure. Melancholy, impressive, lonely, yet accessible from every part of the town, the historic circle was the frequent spot for appointments of a furtive kind. Intrigues were arranged there, tentative meetings were there experimented after divisions and feuds, but one kind of appointment, in itself the most common of any, seldom had place in the amphitheatre, that of happy lovers. Why, seeing that it was preeminently an airy, accessible, and sequestered spot for interviews, the cheerfulest form of those occurrences never took kindly to the soil of the ruin, would be a curious inquiry. Perhaps it was because its associations had about them something sinister. Its history proved that. Apart from the sanguinary nature of the games originally played therein, such incidents attached to its past as these, that for scores of years the town gallows had stood at one corner, that in 1705 a woman who had murdered her husband was half strangled and then burnt there in the presence of 10,000 spectators. Tradition reports that at a certain stage of the burning her heart burst and leapt out of her body, to the terror of them all, and that not one of those 10,000 people ever cared particularly for hot roast after that. In addition to these old tragedies, pugilistic encounters almost to the death had come off down to recent dates in that secluded arena, entirely invisible to the outside world save by climbing to the top of the enclosure, which few townspeople in the daily round of their lives ever took the trouble to do. so that though close to the turnpike road, crimes might be perpetrated there unseen at midday. Some boys had latterly tried to impart gaiety to the ruin by using the central arena as a cricket ground, but the game usually languished for the aforesaid reason. The dismal privacy which the earthen circle enforced, shutting out every appreciative passer's vision, every commendatory remark from outsiders, everything except the sky, and to play at games in such circumstances was like acting to an empty house. Possibly, too, the boys were timid, for some old people said that at certain moments in the summer-time, in broad daylight, persons sitting with a book or dozing in the arena had, on lifting their eyes, beheld the slopes lined with a gazing legion of Hadrian's soldiery, as if watching the gladiatorial combat, and had heard the roar of their excited voices, that the scene would remain but a moment like a lightning flash, and then disappear. It was related that there still remained under the south entrance excavated cells for the reception of the wild animals and athletes who took part in the games. The arena was still smooth and circular, as if used for its original purpose not so very long ago. The sloping pathways by which spectators had ascended to their seats were pathways yet, but the whole was grown over with grass, which now at the end of summer was bearded with withered bents that formed waves under the brush of the wind, returning to the attentive ear aeolian modulations and detaining for moments the flying globes of thistledown. Henchard had chosen this spot as being the safest from observation which he could think of for meeting his long-lost wife, and at the same time as one easily to be found by a stranger after nightfall. As mayor of the town, with a reputation to keep up, he could not invite her to come to his house till some definite course had been decided on. Just before 8 he approached the deserted earthwork, and entered by the south path which descended over the debris of the former dens. In a few moments he could discern a female figure creeping in by the great north gap, or public highway. They met in the middle of the arena. Neither spoke just at first. There was no necessity for speech, and the poor woman leant against Henchard, who supported her in his arms. "I don't drink," he said in a low, halting, apologetic voice. "You hear, Susan? I don't drink now. I haven't since that night." Those were his first words. He felt her bow her head in acknowledgment that she understood. After a minute or two he began again. "If I had known you were living, Susan! But there was every reason to suppose you and the child were dead and gone. I took every possible step to find you, traveled, advertised. My opinion at last was that you had started for some colony with that man and had been drowned on your voyage. Why did you keep silent like this?" "Oh, Michael, because of him. What other reason could there be? I thought I owed him faithfulness to the end of one of our lives. Foolishly I believed there was something solemn and binding in the bargain. I thought that even in honor I dared not desert him when he had paid so much for me in good faith. I meet you now only as his widow. I consider myself that, and that I have no claim upon you. Had he not died I should never have come. Never. Of that you may be sure." "Tch! How could you be so simple?" "I don't know. Yet it would have been very wicked if I had not thought like that," said Susan, almost crying. "Yes, yes, so it would. It is only that which makes me feel an innocent woman. But to lead me into this—" "What, Michael?" she asked, alarmed. "Why, this difficulty about our living together again, and Elizabeth Jane. She cannot be told all. She would so despise us both that I could not bear it. That was why she was brought up in ignorance of you. I could not bear it either." "Well, we must talk of a plan for keeping her in her present belief, and getting matters straight in spite of it. You have heard I am in a large way of business here, that I am mayor of the town, and churchwarden, and I don't know what all." "Yes," she murmured. "These things, as well as the dread of the girl discovering our disgrace, makes it necessary to act with extreme caution, so that I don't see how you two can return openly to my house as the wife and daughter I once treated badly and banished from me. And there's the rub o't. We'll go away at once. I only came to see—" "No, no, Susan, you are not to go. You mistake me," he said with kindly severity. I have thought of this plan, that you and Elizabeth take a cottage in the town as the widow Mrs. Newson and her daughter, that I meet you, court you, and marry you, Elizabeth Jane coming to my house as my stepdaughter. The thing is so natural and easy that it is half done in thinking o't. This would leave my shady, headstrong, disgraceful life as a young man absolutely unopened. The secret would be yours and mine only, and I should have the pleasure of seeing my own only child under my roof as well as my wife. I am quite in your hands, Michael, she said meekly. I came here for the sake of Elizabeth. For myself, if you tell me to leave again tomorrow morning and never come near you more, I am content to go. Now, we don't want to hear that, said Henchard gently. Of course you won't leave again. Think over the plan I have proposed for a few hours, and if you can't hit upon a better one, we'll adopt it. I have to be away for a day or two on business, unfortunately, but during that time you can get lodgings. The only ones in the town fit for you are those over the china shop in High Street, and you can also look for a cottage. If the lodgings are in High Street, they are dear, I suppose. Never mind, you must start genteel if our plan is to be carried out. Look to me for money. Have you enough till I come back? Quite, said she. And are you comfortable at the inn? Oh, yes. And the girl is quite safe from learning the shame of her case and ours? That's what makes me most anxious of all. You would be surprised to find how unlikely she is to dream of the truth. How could she ever suppose such a thing? True. I like the idea of repeating our marriage, said Mrs. Henchard after a pause. It seems the only right course after all this. Now I think I must go back to Elizabeth Jane and tell her that our kinsman, Mr. Henchard, kindly wishes us to stay in the town. Very well, arrange that yourself. I'll go some way with you. No, don't run any risk, said his wife anxiously. I can find my way back. It is not late. Please let me go alone. Right, said Henchard, but just one word. Do you forgive me, Susan? She murmured something, but seemed to find it difficult to frame her answer. Never mind, all in good time, said he. Judge me by my future works. Good-bye. He retreated and stood at the upper side of the amphitheatre, while his wife passed out through the lower way, and descended under the trees to the town. Then Henchard himself went homeward, going so fast that by the time he reached his door he was almost upon the heels of the unconscious woman from whom he had just parted. He watched her up the street, and turned into his house. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. On entering his own door, after watching his wife out of sight, the mayor walked on through the tunnel-shaped passage into the garden, and thence by the back door towards the stores and granaries. A light shone from the office window, and, there being no blind to screen the interior, Henchard could see Donald Farfrae still seated where he had left him, initiating himself into the managerial work of the house by overhauling the books. Henchard entered, merely observing, "Don't let me interrupt you, if you will stay so late." He stood behind Farfrae's chair, watching his dexterity in clearing up the numerical fogs which had been allowed to grow so thick in Henchard's books as almost to baffle even the Scotchman's perspicacity. The corn factor's mien was half admiring, and yet it was not without a dash of pity for the tastes of any one who could care to give his mind to such finikin details. Henchard himself was mentally and physically unfit for grubbing subtleties from soiled paper. He had, in a modern sense, received the education of Achilles, and found penmanship a tantalizing art. "You shall do no more to-night," he said at length, spreading his great hands over the paper. "There's time enough tomorrow. Come indoors with me and have some supper. Now you shall. I am determined on it." He shut the account books with friendly force. Donald had wished to get to his lodgings, but he already saw that his friend and employer was a man who knew no moderation in his requests and impulses, and he yielded gracefully. He liked Henchard's warmth, even if it inconvenienced him, the great difference in their characters adding to the liking. They locked up the office, and the young man followed his companion through the private little door which, admitting directly into Henchard's garden, permitted a passage from the utilitarian to the beautiful at one step. The garden was silent, dewy, and full of perfume. It extended a long way back from the house, first as lawn and flower-beds, then as fruit garden, where the long-tied espaliers, as old as the house itself, had grown so stout and cramped and gnarled that they had pulled their stakes out of the ground and stood distorted and writhing in vegetable agony like leafy lacoons. The flowers which smelt so sweetly were not discernible, and they passed through them into the house. The hospitalities of the morning were repeated, and when they were over Henchard said, "Pull your chair round to the fireplace, my dear fellow, and let's make a blaze. There's nothing I hate like a black grate, even in September." He applied a light to the laid-in fuel, and a cheerful radiance spread around. "It is odd," said Henchard, "that two men should meet as we have done on a purely business ground, and that at the end of the first day I should wish to speak to 'ee on a family matter. But damn it all, I am a lonely man, Farfrae. I have nobody else to speak to, and why shouldn't I tell it to 'ee?" "I'll be glad to hear it if I can be of any service," said Donald, allowing his eyes to travel over the intricate wood carvings of the chimney-piece, representing garlanded lyres, shields, and quivers on either side of a draped ox skull, and flanked by heads of Apollo and Diana in low relief. "I've not been always what I am now," continued Henchard, his firm, deep voice being ever so little shaken. He was plainly under that strange influence which sometimes prompts men to confide to the new-found friend what they will not tell to the old. "I began life as a working hay-trusser, and when I was 18 I married on the strength of my calling. Would you think me a married man?" "I heard in the town that you were a widower." "Ah, yes, you would naturally have heard that. Well, I lost my wife 19 years ago or so, by my own fault. This is how it came about. One summer evening I was traveling for employment, and she was walking at my side, carrying the baby, our only child. We came to a booth in a country fair. I was a drinking man at that time." Henchard paused a moment, threw himself back so that his elbow rested on the table, his forehead being shaded by his hand, which, however, did not hide the marks of introspective inflexibility on his features, as he narrated in fullest detail the incidents of the transaction with the sailor. The tinge of indifference which had at first been visible in the Scotchman now disappeared. Henchard went on to describe his attempts to find his wife, the oath he swore, the solitary life he led during the years which followed. "I have kept my oath for 19 years," he went on. "I have risen to what you see me now." "Eh? Well, no wife could I hear of in all that time, and being by nature something of a woman-hater, I have found it no hardship to keep mostly at a distance from the sex. No wife could I hear of, I say, till this very day, and now she has come back." "Come back, has she?" "This morning, this very morning. And what's to be done?" "Can you no take her, and live with her, and make some amends?" "That's what I've planned and proposed. But, Farfrae," said Henchard gloomily, "by doing right with Susan I wrong another innocent woman." "You don't say that." "In the nature of things, Farfrae, it is almost impossible that a man of my sort should have the good fortune to tide through 20 years of life without making more blunders than one. It has been my custom for many years to run across to Jersey in the way of business, particularly in the potato and root season. I do a large trade with them in that line. Well, one autumn, when stopping there, I fell quite ill, and in my illness I sank into one of those gloomy fits I sometimes suffer from, on account of the loneliness of my domestic life, when the world seems to have the blackness of hell, and, like Job, I could curse the day that gave me birth." "Ah, now I never feel like it," said Farfrae. "Then pray to God that you never may, young man. While in this state I was taken pity on by a woman, a young lady I should call her, for she was of good family, well bred and well educated, the daughter of some harum-scarum military officer who had got into difficulties, and had his pay sequestrated. He was dead now, and her mother too, and she was as lonely as I. This young creature was staying at the boarding-house where I happened to have my lodging, and when I was pulled down she took upon herself to nurse me. From that she got to have a foolish liking for me. Heaven knows why, for I wasn't worth it. But being together in the same house, and her feeling warm, we got naturally intimate. I won't go into particulars of what our relations were. It is enough to say that we honestly meant to marry. There arose a scandal which did me no harm, but was of course ruin to her. Though, Farfrae, between you and me, as man and man, I solemnly declare that philandering with womankind has neither been my vice nor my virtue. She was terribly careless of appearances, and I was, perhaps, more, because of my dreary state, and it was through this that the scandal arose. At last I was well, and came away. When I was gone, she suffered much on my account, and didn't forget to tell me so in letters, one after another, till latterly I felt I owed her something, and thought that, as I had not heard of Susan for so long, I would make this other one the only return I could make, and ask her if she would run the risk of Susan being alive, very slight as I believed, and marry me such as I was. She jumped for joy, and we should no doubt soon have been married, but behold, Susan appears. Donald showed his deep concern at a complication so far beyond the degree of his simple experiences. Now see what injury a man may cause around him. Even after that wrong-doing at the fair when I was young, if I had never been so selfish as to let this giddy girl devote herself to me over at Jersey, to the injury of her name, all might now be well. Yet as it stands, I must bitterly disappoint one of these women, and it is the second. My first duty is to Susan, there's no doubt about that. They are both in a very melancholy position, and that's true, murmured Donald. They are. For myself, I don't care. 'Twill all end one way. But these two— Henchard paused in reverie. I feel I should like to treat the second, no less than the first, as kindly as a man can in such a case. Ah, well, it cannot be helped, said the other with a philosophic woefulness. You mun write to the young lady, and in your letter you must put it plain and honest that it turns out she cannot be her wife, the first having come back, that she cannot see her more, and that you wish her weel. That won't do. Od seize it, I must do a little more than that. I must, though she did always brag about her rich uncle or rich aunt, and her expectations from 'em. I must send a useful sum of money to her, I suppose, just as a little recompense, poor girl. Now, will you help me in this, and draw up an explanation to her of all I've told ye, breaking it as gently as you can? I'm so bad at letters. And I will. Now, I haven't told you quite all yet. My wife Susan has my daughter with her, the baby that was in her arms at the fair, and this girl knows nothing of me beyond that I am some sort of relation by marriage. She has grown up in the belief that the sailor to whom I made over her mother, and who is now dead, was her father, and her mother's husband. What her mother has always felt, she and I together feel now, that we can't proclaim our disgrace to the girl by letting her know the truth. Now what would you do? I want your advice. I think I'd run the risk and tell her the truth. She'll forgive you both. Never, said Henchard. I am not going to let her know the truth. Her mother and I be going to marry again, and it will not only help us to keep our child's respect, but it will be more proper. Susan looks upon herself as the sailor's widow, and won't think of living with me as formerly without another religious ceremony, and she's right. Farfrae thereupon said no more. The letter to the young Jersey woman was carefully framed by him, and the interview ended, Henchard saying, as the Scotchman left, I feel it a great relief, Farfrae, to tell some friend of this. You see now that the Mayor of Casterbridge is not so thriving in his mind as it seems he might be from the state of his pocket. I do, and am sorry for ye, said Farfrae. When he was gone, Henchard copied the letter, and enclosing a cheque took it to the post office, from which he walked back thoughtfully. Can it be that it will go off so easily? He said. Poor thing, God knows. Now then, to make amends to Susan. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. The cottage which Michael Henchard hired for his wife Susan, under her name of Newson, in pursuance of their plan, was in the upper or western part of the town, near the Roman wall and the avenue which overshadowed it. The evening sun seemed to shine more yellowly there than anywhere else this autumn, stretching its rays, as the hours grew later, under the lowest sycamore boughs, and steeping the ground floor of the dwelling, with its green shutters, in a substratum of radiance which the foliage screened from the upper parts. Beneath these sycamores on the town walls could be seen from the sitting-room the tumuli and earth forts of the distant uplands, making it altogether a pleasant spot, with the usual touch of melancholy that a past-marked prospect lends. As soon as the mother and daughter were comfortably installed, with a white-aproned servant and all complete, Henchard paid them a visit and remained to tea. During the entertainment Elizabeth was carefully hoodwinked by the very general tone of the conversation that prevailed, a proceeding which seemed to afford some humour to Henchard, though his wife was not particularly happy in it. The visit was repeated again and again with business-like determination by the Mayor, who seemed to have schooled himself into a course of strict mechanical rightness towards this woman of prior claim, at any expense to the later one and to his own sentiments. One afternoon the daughter was not indoors when Henchard came, and he said dryly, "This is a very good opportunity for me to ask you to name the happy day, Susan." The poor woman smiled faintly. She did not enjoy pleasantries on a situation into which she had entered solely for the sake of her girl's reputation. She liked them so little, indeed, that there was room for wonder why she had countenanced deception at all, and had not bravely let the girl know her history. But the flesh is weak, and the true explanation came in due course. "Oh, Michael," she said, "I am afraid all this is taking up your time and giving trouble, when I did not expect any such thing." And she looked at him, and at his dress as a man of affluence, and at the furniture he had provided for the room, ornate and lavish to her eyes. "Not at all," said Henchard in rough benignity. "This is only a cottage. It costs me next to nothing, and as to taking up my time—" Here his red and black visage kindled with satisfaction. "I've a splendid fellow to superintend my business now, a man whose like I've never been able to lay hands on before. I shall soon be able to leave everything to him and have more time to call my own than I've had for these last 20 years. Henchard's visits here grew so frequent and so regular that it soon became whispered, and then openly discussed in Casterbridge, that the masterful, coercive mayor of the town was raptured and enervated by the genteel widow, Mrs. Newson. His well-known haughty indifference to the society of womankind, his silent avoidance of converse with the sex, contributed a piquancy to what would otherwise have been an unromantic matter enough. That such a poor fragile woman should be his choice was inexplicable, except on the ground that the engagement was a family affair in which sentimental passion had no place, for it was known that they were related in some way. Mrs. Henchard was so pale that the boys called her the ghost. Sometimes Henchard overheard this epithet when they passed together along the walks, as the avenues on the walls were named, at which his face would darken with an expression of destructiveness towards the speakers ominous to see. But he said nothing. He pressed on the preparations for his union, or rather reunion, with this pale creature, in a dogged, unflinching spirit which did credit to his conscientiousness. Nobody would have conceived from his outward demeanour that there was no amatory fire or pulse of romance acting as stimulant to the bustle going on in his gaunt great house. Nothing but 3 large resolves: one, to make amends to his neglected Susan; another, to provide a comfortable home for Elizabeth Jane under his paternal eye; and a third, to castigate himself with the thorns which these restitutory acts brought in their train, among them the lowering of his dignity in public opinion by marrying so comparatively humble a woman. Susan Henchard entered a carriage for the first time in her life when she stepped into the plain brougham which drew up at the door on the wedding day to take her and Elizabeth Jane to church. It was a windless morning of warm November rain, which floated down like meal and lay in a powdery form on the nap of hats and coats. Few people had gathered round the church door, though they were well packed within. The Scotchman, who assisted as groomsman, was of course the only one present, beyond the chief actors, who knew the true situation of the contracting parties. He, however, was too inexperienced, too thoughtful, too judicial, too strongly conscious of the serious side of the business, to enter into the scene in its dramatic aspect. That required the special genius of Christopher Coney, Solomon Longways, Busford, and their fellows. But they knew nothing of the secret, though, as the time for coming out of church drew on, they gathered on the pavement adjoining and expounded the subject according to their lights. "'Tis 45 years since I had my settlement in this here town," said Coney, "but daze me if I ever see a man wait so long before to take so little. There's a chance even for thee after this, Nance Mockridge." The remark was addressed to a woman who stood behind his shoulder, the same who had exhibited Henchard's bad bread in public when Elizabeth and her mother entered Casterbridge. "Be cussed if I'd marry any such as he or thee either," replied that lady. As for thee, Christopher, we know what ye be, and the less said the better. And as for he, well, there," lowering her voice, "'tis said 'a was a poor parish prentice. I wouldn't say it for all the world, but 'a was a poor parish prentice that began life with no more belonging to un than a carrion crow." "And now he's worth ever so much a minute," murmured Longways. "When a man is said to be worth so much a minute, he's a man to be considered." Turning, he saw a circular disc reticulated with creases, and recognized the smiling countenance of the fat woman who had asked for another song at the Three Mariners. "Well, Mother Cuxsom," he said, "how's this? Here's Mrs. Newson, a mere skeleton, has got another husband to keep her, while a woman of your tonnage have not." "I have not, nor another to beat me. Ah, yes, Cuxsom's gone, and so shall leather breeches. Yes, with the blessing of God, leather breeches shall go." "'Tisn't worth my old while to think of another husband," continued Mrs. Cuxsom, "and yet I'll lay my life I'm as respectable born as she." "True, your mother was a very good woman, I can mind her. She were rewarded by the Agricultural Society for having begot the greatest number of healthy children without parish assistance, and other virtuous marvels. 'Twas that kept us so low upon ground, that great hungry family. Where the pigs be many, the wash runs thin." "And dostn't mind how mother would sing, Christopher?" continued Mrs. Cuxsom, kindling at the retrospection. "And how we went with her to the party at Mellstock, do ye mind? At old Dame Ledlow's, Farmer Shiner's aunt, do ye mind? She we used to call Toadskin, because her face were so yaller and freckled. Do ye mind?" "I do, he, I do," said Christopher Coney. "And well do I, for I was getting up husband high at that time, one half girl and t'other half woman, as one may say. And canst mind," she prodded Solomon's shoulder with her finger-tip, while her eyes twinkled between the crevices of their lids, "canst mind the sherry wine and the silver snuffers, and how Joan Dummett was took bad when we were coming home, and Jack Griggs was forced to carry her through the mud, and how a let her fall in Dairyman Sweetapple's cow barton, and we had to clane her gown wi' grass? Never such a mess as a were in." That I do, he. Such doggery as there was in them ancient days, to be sure. Ah, the miles I used to walk then, and now I can hardly step over a furrow." Their reminiscences were cut short by the appearance of the reunited pair, Henchard looking round upon the idlers with that ambiguous gaze of his, which at one moment seemed to mean satisfaction, and at another fiery disdain. "Well, there's a difference between 'em, though he do call himself a teetotaler," said Nance Mockridge. "She'll wish her cake dough afore she's done of him. There's a Bluebeardy look about un, and 'twill out in time." "Stuff, he's well enough. Some folk want their luck buttered. If I had a choice as wide as the ocean sea, I wouldn't wish for a better man. A poor twanking woman like her, 'tis a godsend for her, and hardly a pair of jumps or night rail to her name." The plain little brougham drove off in the mist, and the idlers dispersed. "Well, we hardly know how to look at things in these times," said Solomon. "There was a man dropped down dead yesterday, not so very many miles from here, and what with that and this moist weather, 'tis scarce worth one's while to begin any work of consequence to-day. I'm in such a low key with drinking nothing but small table ninepenny this last week or two, that I shall call and warm up at the Marners as I pass along." "I don't know but that I may as well go with 'ee, Solomon," said Christopher. "I'm as clammy as a cockle snail." Chapter 14. A Martinmas summer of Mrs. Henchard's life set in with her entry into her husband's large house and respectable social orbit, and it was as bright as such summers well can be. Lest she should pine for deeper affection than he could give, he made a point of showing some semblance of it in external action. Among other things, he had the iron railings, that had smiled sadly in dull rust for the last 80 years, painted a bright green, and the heavy barred small-paned Georgian sash windows enlivened with 3 coats of white. He was as kind to her as a man, mayor, and churchwarden could possibly be. The house was large, the rooms lofty, and the landings wide, and the 2 unassuming women scarcely made a perceptible addition to its contents. To Elizabeth Jane the time was a most triumphant one. The freedom she experienced, the indulgence with which she was treated, went beyond her expectations. The reposeful, easy, affluent life to which her mother's marriage had introduced her was, in truth, the beginning of a great change in Elizabeth. She found she could have nice personal possessions and ornaments for the asking, and, as the medieval saying puts it, take, have, and keep are pleasant words. With peace of mind came development, and with development beauty. Knowledge, the result of great natural insight, she did not lack. Learning, accomplishment, those, alas, she had not, but as the winter and spring passed by, her thin face and figure filled out in rounder and softer curves, the lines and contractions upon her young brow went away, the muddiness of skin, which she had looked upon as her lot by nature, departed with a change to abundance of good things, and a bloom came upon her cheek. Perhaps, too, her grey thoughtful eyes revealed an arch gaiety sometimes, but this was infrequent. The sort of wisdom which looked from their pupils did not readily keep company with these lighter moods. Like all people who have known rough times, light-heartedness seemed to her too irrational and inconsequent to be indulged in except as a reckless dram now and then, for she had been too early habituated to anxious reasoning to drop the habit suddenly. She felt none of those ups and downs of spirit which beset so many people without cause. Never, to paraphrase a recent poet, never a gloom in Elizabeth Jane's soul but she well knew how it came there. And her present cheerfulness was fairly proportionate to her solid guarantees for the same. It might have been supposed that, given a girl rapidly becoming good-looking, comfortably circumstanced, and for the first time in her life commanding ready money, she would go and make a fool of herself by dress. But no. The reasonableness of almost everything that Elizabeth did was nowhere more conspicuous than in this question of clothes. To keep in the rear of opportunity in matters of indulgence is as valuable a habit as to keep abreast of opportunity in matters of enterprise. This unsophisticated girl did it by an innate perceptiveness that was almost genius. Thus she refrained from bursting out like a water-flower that spring and clothing herself in puffings and knick-knacks, as most of the Casterbridge girls would have done in her circumstances. Her triumph was tempered by circumspection. She had still that field-mouse fear of the coulter of destiny despite fair promise, which is common among the thoughtful who have suffered early from poverty and oppression. "I won't be too gay on any account," she would say to herself. "It would be tempting Providence to hurl mother and me down and afflict us again as he used to do." We now see her in a black silk bonnet, velvet mantle or silk spencer, dark dress, and carrying a sunshade. In this latter article she drew the line at fringe, and had it plain-edged, with a little ivory ring for keeping it closed. It was odd about the necessity for that sunshade. She discovered that with the clarification of her complexion and the birth of pink cheeks her skin had grown more sensitive to the sun's rays. She protected those cheeks forthwith, deeming spotlessness part of womanliness. Henchard had become very fond of her, and she went out with him more frequently than with her mother now. Her appearance one day was so attractive that he looked at her critically. "I happened to have the ribbon by me, so I made it up," she faltered, thinking him perhaps dissatisfied with some rather bright trimming she had donned for the first time. Of course, to be sure," he replied in his leonine way. "Do as you like, or rather as your mother advises ye. Od send, I've nothing to say to't." Indoors she appeared with her hair divided by a parting that arched like a white rainbow from ear to ear. All in front of this line was covered with a thick encampment of curls. All behind was dressed smoothly and drawn to a knob. The three members of the family were sitting at breakfast one day, and Henchard was looking silently, as he often did, at this head of hair, which in colour was brown, rather light than dark. "I thought Elizabeth Jane's hair— Didn't you tell me that Elizabeth Jane's hair promised to be black when she was a baby?" he said to his wife. She looked startled, jerked his foot warningly, and murmured, "Did I?" As soon as Elizabeth was gone to her own room, Henchard resumed. "Begad, I nearly forgot myself just now. What I meant was that the girl's hair certainly looked as if it would be darker when she was a baby." "It did, but they alter so," replied Susan. "Their hair gets darker, I know, but I wasn't aware it lightened ever." "Oh, yes." and the same uneasy expression came out on her face to which the future held the key. It passed as Henchard went on. "Well, so much the better. Now, Susan, I want to have her called Miss Henchard, not Miss Newson. Lots of people do it already in carelessness. It is her legal name, so it may as well be made her usual name. I don't like t'other name at all for my own flesh and blood. I'll advertise it in the Casterbridge paper. That's the way they do it. She won't object." "No, oh no, but—" "Well, then I shall do it," he said peremptorily. "Surely if she's willing, you must wish it as much as I." "Oh, yes. If she agrees, let us do it by all means," she replied. Then Mrs. Henchard acted somewhat inconsistently. It might have been called falsely, but that her manner was emotional and full of the earnestness of one who wishes to do right at great hazard. She went to Elizabeth Jane, whom she found sewing in her own sitting-room upstairs, and told her what had been proposed about her surname. "Can you agree? Is it not a slight upon Newson, now he's dead and gone?" Elizabeth reflected. "I'll think of it, mother," she answered. When, later in the day, she saw Henchard, she adverted to the matter at once, in a way which showed that the line of feeling started by her mother had been persevered in. "Do you wish this change so very much, sir?" she asked. "Wish it? Why, my blessed fathers, what an ado you women make about a trifle! I proposed it, that's all. Now, Lisbeth Jane, just please yourself. Curse me if I care what you do. Now you understand, don't 'ee go agreeing to it to please me." Here the subject dropped, and nothing more was said, and nothing was done, and Elizabeth still passed as Miss Newson, and not by her legal name. Meanwhile the great corn and hay traffic conducted by Henchard throve under the management of Donald Farfrae as it had never thriven before. It had formerly moved in jolts, now it went on oiled casters. The old crude viva voce system of Henchard, in which everything depended upon his memory, and bargains were made by the tongue alone, was swept away. Letters and ledgers took the place of "I'll do't," and "you shall ha't," and, as in all such cases of advance, the rugged picturesqueness of the old method disappeared with its inconveniences. The position of Elizabeth Jane's room, rather high in the house, so that it commanded a view of the hay stores and granaries across the garden, afforded her opportunity for accurate observation of what went on there. She saw that Donald and Mr. Henchard were inseparables. When walking together, Henchard would lay his arm familiarly on his manager's shoulder, as if Farfrae were a younger brother, bearing so heavily that his slight frame bent under the weight. Occasionally she would hear a perfect cannonade of laughter from Henchard, arising from something Donald had said, the latter looking quite innocent and not laughing at all. In Henchard's somewhat lonely life he evidently found the young man as desirable for comradeship as he was useful for consultations. Donald's brightness of intellect maintained in the corn factor the admiration it had won at the first hour of their meeting. The poor opinion, and but ill concealed, that he entertained of the slim Farfrae's physical girth, strength, and dash was more than counterbalanced by the immense respect he had for his brains. Her quiet eye discerned that Henchard's tigerish affection for the younger man, his constant liking to have Farfrae near him, now and then resulted in a tendency to domineer, which, however, was checked in a moment when Donald exhibited marks of real offence. One day, looking down on their figures from on high, she heard the latter remark, as they stood in the doorway between the garden and yard, that their habit of walking and driving about together rather neutralized Farfrae's value as a second pair of eyes, which should be used in places where the principal was not. "Ah, damn it!" cried Henchard. "What's all the world? I like a feller to talk to. Now come along and have some supper, and don't take too much thought about things, or you'll drive me crazy." When she walked with her mother, on the other hand, she often beheld the Scotchman looking at them with a curious interest. The fact that he had met her at the Three Mariners was insufficient to account for it, since on the occasions on which she had entered his room he had never raised his eyes. Besides, it was at her mother more particularly than at herself that he looked, to Elizabeth Jane's half-conscious, simple-minded, perhaps pardonable disappointment. Thus she could not account for this interest by her own attractiveness, and she decided that it might be apparent only, a way of turning his eyes that Mr. Farfrae had. She did not divine the ample explanation of his manner without personal vanity that was afforded by the fact of Donald being the depository of Henchard's confidence in respect of his past treatment of the pale, chastened mother who walked by her side. Her conjectures on that past never went further than faint ones based on things casually heard and seen, mere guesses that Henchard and her mother might have been lovers in their younger days, who had quarrelled and parted. Casterbridge, as has been hinted, was a place deposited in the block upon a cornfield. There was no suburb in the modern sense, or transitional intermixture of town and down. It stood, with regard to the wide fertile land adjoining, clean-cut and distinct, like a chessboard on a green tablecloth. The farmer's boy could sit under his barley-mow and pitch a stone into the office window of the town clerk. Reapers at work among the sheaves nodded to acquaintances standing on the pavement corner. The red-robed judge, when he condemned a sheep-stealer, pronounced sentence to the tune of "Bah!" that floated in at the window from the remainder of the flock browsing hard by, and at executions the waiting crowd stood in a meadow immediately before the drop, out of which the cows had been temporarily driven to give the spectators room. The corn grown on the upland side of the borough was garnered by farmers who lived in an eastern purlieu called Durnover. Here wheat ricks overhung the old Roman street and thrust their eaves against the church tower. Green-thatched barns, with doorways as high as the gates of Solomon's Temple, opened directly upon the main thoroughfare. Barns, indeed, were so numerous as to alternate with every half-dozen houses along the way. Here lived burgesses who daily walked the fallow, shepherds in an intramural squeeze, a street of farmers' homesteads, a street ruled by a mayor and corporation, yet echoing with the thump of the flail, the flutter of the winnowing fan, and the purr of the milk into the pails, a street which had nothing urban in it whatever. This was the Durnover end of Casterbridge. Henchard, as was natural, dealt largely with this nursery or bed of small farmers close at hand, and his wagons were often down that way. One day, when arrangements were in progress for getting home corn from one of the aforesaid farms, Elizabeth Jane received a note by hand asking her to oblige the writer by coming at once to a granary on Durnover Hill. As this was the granary whose contents Henchard was removing, she thought the request had something to do with his business, and proceeded thither as soon as she had put on her bonnet. The granary was just within the farmyard, and stood on stone staddles high enough for persons to walk under. The gates were open, but nobody was within. However, she entered and waited. Presently she saw a figure approaching the gate, that of Donald Farfrae. He looked up at the church clock and came in. By some unaccountable shyness, some wish not to meet him there alone, she quickly ascended the step-ladder leading to the granary door, and entered it before he had seen her. Farfrae advanced, imagining himself in solitude, and a few drops of rain beginning to fall, he moved and stood under the shelter where she had just been standing. Here he leant against one of the staddles and gave himself up to patience. He, too, was plainly expecting someone. Could it be herself? If so, why? In a few minutes he looked at his watch, and then pulled out a note, a duplicate of the one she had herself received. This situation began to be very awkward, and the longer she waited the more awkward it became. To emerge from a door just above his head and descend the ladder and show she had been in hiding there would look so very foolish that she still waited on. A winnowing machine stood close beside her, and to relieve her suspense she gently moved the handle, whereupon a cloud of wheat husks flew out into her face and covered her clothes and bonnet and stuck into the fur of her victorine. He must have heard the slight movement, for he looked up, and then ascended the steps. "Ah, it's Miss Newson," he said, as soon as he could see into the granary. "I didn't know you were there. I have kept the appointment, and am at your service." "Oh, Mr. Farfrae," she faltered, "so have I. But I didn't know it was you who wished to see me. Otherwise I wished to see you? Oh, no. At least, that is, I am afraid there may be a mistake." "Didn't you ask me to come here? Didn't you write this?" Elizabeth held out her note. "No. Indeed, at no hand would I have thought of it. And for you, didn't you ask me? This is not your writing?" And he held up his. "By no means." "And is that really so? Then it's somebody wanting to see us both. Perhaps we would do well to wait a little longer." Acting on this consideration, they lingered, Elizabeth Jane's face being arranged to an expression of preternatural composure, and the young Scot, at every footstep in the street without, looking from under the granary to see if the passer were about to enter and declare himself their summoner. They watched individual drops of rain creeping down the thatch of the opposite rick, straw after straw, till they reached the bottom, but nobody came, and the granary roof began to drip. "The person is not likely to be coming," said Farfrae. "It's a trick, perhaps, and if so, it's a great pity to waste our time like this, and so much to be done." "'Tis a great liberty," said Elizabeth. "It's true, Miss Newson. We'll hear news of this some day, depend on't. And who it was that did it, I wouldn't stand for it hindering myself. But you, Miss Newson—" "I don't mind much," she replied. "Neither do I." They lapsed again into silence. "You are anxious to get back to Scotland, I suppose, Mr. Farfrae?" she inquired. "Oh, no, Miss Newson. Why would I be?" "I only supposed you might be from the song you sang at the Three Mariners, about Scotland and home, I mean, which you seemed to feel so deep down in your heart, so that we all felt for you." "Ay, and I did sing there, I did. But, Miss Newson," and Donald's voice musically undulated between two semitones, as it always did when he became earnest, "it's well you feel a song for a few minutes, and your eyes they get quite tearful, but you finish it, and for all you felt you don't mind it or think of it again for a long while. Oh no, I don't want to go back. Yet I'll sing the song to you with pleasure whenever you like. I could sing it now and not mind at all." "Thank you, indeed, but I fear I must go, rain or no." Then, Miss Newson, ye had better say nothing about this hoax, and take no heed of it. And if the person should say anything to you, be civil to him or her as if you did not mind it, so you'll take the clever person's laugh away." In speaking, his eyes became fixed upon her dress, still sown with wheat husks. "There's husks and dust on you. Perhaps you don't know it," he said, in tones of extreme delicacy. "And it's very bad to let rain come upon clothes when there's chaff on them. It washes in and spoils them. Let me help you. Blowing is the best." As Elizabeth neither assented nor dissented, Donald Farfrae began blowing her back hair and her side hair and her neck and the crown of her bonnet and the fur of her victorine, Elizabeth saying, "Oh, thank you," at every puff. At last she was fairly clean, though Farfrae, having got over his first concern at the situation, seemed in no manner of hurry to be gone. "Ah, now, I'll go and get you an umbrella," he said. She declined the offer, stepped out, and was gone. Farfrae walked slowly after, looking thoughtfully at her diminishing figure and whistling in undertones, "As I came down through Canoby." End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15. At first Miss Newson's budding beauty was not regarded with much interest by anybody in Casterbridge. Donald Farfrae's gaze, it is true, was now attracted by the mayor's so-called stepdaughter, but he was only one. The truth is that she was but a poor illustrative instance of the prophet Baruch's sly definition, "the virgin that loveth to go gay." When she walked abroad she seemed to be occupied with an inner chamber of ideas, and to have slight need for visible objects. She formed curious resolves on checking gay fancies in the matter of clothes, because it was inconsistent with her past life to blossom gaudily the moment she had become possessed of money. But nothing is more insidious than the evolution of wishes from mere fancies, and of wants from mere wishes. Henchard gave Elizabeth Jane a box of delicately tinted gloves one spring day. She wanted to wear them to show her appreciation of his kindness, but she had no bonnet that would harmonize. As an artistic indulgence she thought she would have such a bonnet. When she had a bonnet that would go with the gloves, she had no dress that would go with the bonnet. It was now absolutely necessary to finish. She ordered the requisite article, and found that she had no sunshade to go with the dress. In for a penny, in for a pound. She bought the sunshade, and the whole structure was at last complete. Everybody was attracted, and some said that her bygone simplicity was the art that conceals art, the delicate imposition of Rochefoucauld. She had produced an effect, a contrast, and it had been done on purpose. As a matter of fact, this was not true, but it had its result, for as soon as Casterbridge thought her artful, it thought her worth notice. "It is the first time in my life that I have been so much admired," she said to herself, "though perhaps it is by those whose admiration is not worth having." But Donald Farfrae admired her too, and altogether the time was an exciting one. Sex had never before asserted itself in her so strongly, for in former days she had perhaps been too impersonally human to be distinctively feminine. After an unprecedented success one day, she came indoors, went upstairs, and leant upon her bed face downwards, quite forgetting the possible creasing and damage. "Good heavens!" she whispered. "Can it be? Here am I, setting up as the town beauty?" When she had thought it over, her usual fear of exaggerating appearances engendered a deep sadness. "There is something wrong in all this," she mused. "If they only knew what an unfinished girl I am, that I can't talk Italian or use globes, or show any of the accomplishments they learn at boarding schools, how they would despise me. Better sell all this finery and buy myself grammar books and dictionaries and a history of all the philosophies." She looked from the window and saw Henchard and Farfrae in the hay-yard talking, with that impetuous cordiality on the mayor's part, and genial modesty on the younger man's, that was now so generally observable in their intercourse. Friendship between man and man, what a rugged strength there was in it, as evinced by these two! And yet the seed that was to lift the foundation of this friendship was at that moment taking root in a chink of its structure. It was about 6 o'clock. The men were dropping off homeward one by one. The last to leave was a round-shouldered, blinking young man of 19 or 20, whose mouth fell ajar on the slightest provocation, seemingly because there was no chin to support it. Henchard called aloud to him as he went out of the gate, "Here, Abel Whittle!" Whittle turned and ran back a few steps. "Yes, sir," he said in breathless deprecation, as if he knew what was coming next. "Once more, be in time to-morrow morning. You see what's to be done, and you hear what I say, and you know I'm not going to be trifled with any longer." "Yes, sir." Then Abel Whittle left, and Henchard and Farfrae and Elizabeth saw no more of them. Now there was good reason for this command on Henchard's part. Poor Abel, as he was called, had an inveterate habit of oversleeping himself and coming late to his work. His anxious will was to be among the earliest, but if his comrades omitted to pull the string that he always tied round his great toe and left hanging out the window for that purpose, his will was as wind. He did not arrive in time. As he was often second hand at the hay weighing, or at the crane which lifted the sacks, or was one of those who had to accompany the wagons into the country to fetch away stacks that had been purchased, this affliction of Abel's was productive of much inconvenience. For 2 mornings in the present week he had kept the others waiting nearly an hour, hence Henchard's threat. It now remained to be seen what would happen to-morrow. 6 o'clock struck, and there was no Whittle. At 6:30 Henchard entered the yard. The wagon was horsed that Abel was to accompany, and the other man had been waiting 20 minutes. Then Henchard swore, and Whittle, coming up breathless at that instant, the corn factor turned on him, and declared with an oath that this was the last time, that if he were behind once more, by God, he would come and drag him out of bed. "There is summat wrong in my make, your worshipful," said Abel, "especially in the inside, whereas my poor dumb brain gets as dead as a clot afore I've said my few scrags of prayers. Yes, it came on as a stripling, just afore I'd got man's wages, whereas I never enjoy my bed at all, for no sooner do I lie down than I be asleep, and afore I be awake I be up. I've fretted my gizzard green about it, maister, but what can I do? Now last night, afore I went to bed, I only had a scantling of cheese, and—" "I don't want to hear it," roared Henchard. "To-morrow the wagons must start at 4, and if you're not here, stand clear. I'll mortify thy flesh for thee." "But let me clear up my points, your worshipful—" Henchard turned away. "He asked me, and he questioned me, and then 'a wouldn't hear my points," said Abel to the yard in general. "Now I shall twitch like a moment hand all night to-night for fear of him." The journey to be taken by the wagons next day was a long one into Blackmoor Vale, and at 4 o'clock lanterns were moving about the yard, but Abel was missing. Before either of the other men could run to Abel's and warn him, Henchard appeared in the garden doorway. "Where's Abel Whittle? Not come, after all I've said? Now I'll carry out my word, by my blessed fathers. Nothing else will do him any good. I'm going up that way." Henchard went off, entered Abel's house, a little cottage in back street, the door of which was never locked because the inmates had nothing to lose. Reaching Whittle's bedside, the corn factor shouted a bass note so vigorously that Abel started up instantly, and beholding Henchard standing over him was galvanized into spasmodic movements which had not much relation to getting on his clothes. "Out of bed, sir, and off to the granary, or you leave my employ to-day. 'Tis to teach ye a lesson. March on, never mind your breeches." The unhappy Whittle threw on his sleeve waistcoat and managed to get into his boots at the bottom of the stairs, while Henchard thrust his hat over his head. Whittle then trotted on down back street, Henchard walking sternly behind. Just at this time Farfrae, who had been to Henchard's house to look for him, came out of the back gate and saw something white fluttering in the morning gloom, which he soon perceived to be part of Abel's shirt that showed below his waistcoat. "For mercy's sake, what object's this?" said Farfrae, following Abel into the yard, Henchard being some way in the rear by this time. "You see, Mr. Farfrae," gibbered Abel with a resigned smile of terror, "he said he'd mortify my flesh if so be I didn't get up sooner, and now he's a-doing on't. You see it can't be helped, Mr. Farfrae. Things do happen queer sometimes. Yes, I'll go to Blackmoor Vale half naked as I be, since he do command, but I shall kill myself afterwards. I can't outlive the disgrace, for the women folk will be looking out of their windows at my mortification all the way along, and laughing me to scorn as a man without breeches. You know how I feel such things, Maister Farfrae, and how forlorn thoughts get hold upon me. Yes, I shall do myself harm, I feel it coming on." "Get back home and slip on your breeches, and come to work like a man. If you go not, you'll have your death standing there." "I'm afeard I mustn't. Mr. Henchard said—" "I don't care what Mr. Henchard said, nor anybody else. 'Tis simple foolishness to do this. Go and dress yourself instantly, Whittle." "Hullo, hullo," said Henchard, coming up behind. "Who's sending him back?" All the men looked towards Farfrae. "I am," said Donald. "I say this joke has been carried far enough." "And I say it hasn't. Get up in the wagon, Whittle." "Not if I am manager," said Farfrae. "He either goes home or I march out of this yard for good." Henchard looked at him with a face stern and red, but he paused for a moment, and their eyes met. Donald went up to him, for he saw in Henchard's look that he began to regret this. "Come," said Donald quietly, "a man of your position should ken better, sir. It is tyrannical, and no worthy of you." "'Tis not tyrannical," murmured Henchard, like a sullen boy. "It is to make him remember." He presently added, in a tone of one bitterly hurt, "Why did you speak to me before them like that, Farfrae? You might have stopped till we were alone. Ah, I know why. I've told you the secret of my life, fool that I was to do it, and you take advantage of me." "I had forgot it," said Farfrae simply. Henchard looked on the ground, said nothing more, and turned away. During the day Farfrae learnt from the men that Henchard had kept Abel's old mother in coals and snuff all the previous winter, which made him less antagonistic to the corn factor. But Henchard continued moody and silent, and when one of the men inquired of him if some oats should be hoisted to an upper floor or not, he said shortly, "Ask Mr. Farfrae, he's master here." Morally he was, there could be no doubt of it. Henchard, who had hitherto been the most admired man in his circle, was the most admired no longer. One day the daughters of a deceased farmer in Durnover wanted an opinion of the value of their haystack, and sent a messenger to ask Mr. Farfrae to oblige them with one. The messenger, who was a child, met in the yard not Farfrae but Henchard. "Very well," he said, "I'll come." "But please, will Mr. Farfrae come?" said the child. "I am going that way. Why Mr. Farfrae?" said Henchard, with the fixed look of thought. "Why do people always want Mr. Farfrae?" "I suppose because they like him so. That's what they say." "Oh, I see. That's what they say, hey? They like him because he's cleverer than Mr. Henchard, and because he knows more, and, in short, Mr. Henchard can't hold a candle to him, hey?" Yes, that's just it, sir. Some of it." "Oh, there's more?" "Of course there's more. What besides? Come, here's a sixpence for a fairing." "And he's better tempered, and Henchard's a fool to him, they say. And when some of the women were a-walking home, they said, 'He's a diamond, he's a chap o' wax, he's the best, he's the horse for my money,' says they. And they said, 'He's the most understanding man of them two by long chalk. I wish he was the master instead of Henchard,' they said." "They'll talk any nonsense," Henchard replied with covered gloom. "Well, you can go now, and I am coming to value the hay, d'ye hear? Aye." The boy departed, and Henchard murmured, "Wish he were master here, do they?" He went towards Durnover. On his way he overtook Farfrae. They walked on together, Henchard looking mostly on the ground. "You're no yourself the day?" Donald inquired. "Yes, I am very well," said Henchard. "But ye are a bit down. Surely you're down. Why, there's nothing to be angry about. 'Tis splendid stuff that we've got from Blackmoor Vale. By the by, the people in Durnover want their hay valued." "Yes, I am going there." "I'll go with ye." As Henchard did not reply, Donald practised a piece of music sotto voce, till, getting near the bereaved people's door, he stopped himself with, "Ah, as their father is dead, I won't go on with such as that. How could I forget?" "Do you care so very much about hurting folks' feelings?" observed Henchard with a half sneer. "You do, I know, especially mine." "I am sorry if I have hurt yours, sir," replied Donald, standing still, with a second expression of the same sentiment in the regretfulness of his face. "Why should you say it? Think it." The cloud lifted from Henchard's brow, and as Donald finished, the corn merchant turned to him, regarding his breast rather than his face. "I have been hearing things that vexed me," he said. "'Twas that made me short in my manner, made me overlook what you really are. Now, I don't want to go in here about this hay, Farfrae. You can do it better than I. They sent for 'ee, too. I have to attend a meeting of the town council at 11, and 'tis drawing on for it." They parted thus in renewed friendship, Donald forbearing to ask Henchard for meanings that were not very plain to him. On Henchard's part there was now again repose, and yet, whenever he thought of Farfrae, it was with a dim dread, and he often regretted that he had told the young man his whole heart, and confided to him the secrets of his life. Chapter 16. On this account Henchard's manner towards Farfrae insensibly became more reserved. He was courteous, too courteous, and Farfrae was quite surprised at the good breeding which now for the first time showed itself among the qualities of a man he had hitherto thought undisciplined, if warm and sincere. The corn factor seldom or never again put his arm upon the young man's shoulder so as to nearly weigh him down with the pressure of mechanized friendship. He left off coming to Donald's lodgings, and shouting into the passage, "Hoy, Farfrae boy, come and have some dinner with us. Don't sit here in solitary confinement." But in the daily routine of their business there was little change. Thus their lives rolled on, till a day of public rejoicing was suggested to the country at large in celebration of a national event that had recently taken place. For some time Casterbridge, by nature slow, made no response. Then one day Donald Farfrae broached the subject to Henchard by asking if he would have any objection to lend some rick-cloths to himself and a few others who contemplated getting up an entertainment of some sort on the day named, and required a shelter for the same, to which they might charge admission at the rate of so much a head. "Have as many cloths as you like," Henchard replied. When his manager had gone about the business, Henchard was fired with emulation. It certainly had been very remiss of him, as mayor, he thought, to call no meeting ere this to discuss what should be done on this holiday. But Farfrae had been so cursed quick in his movements as to give old-fashioned people in authority no chance of the initiative. However, it was not too late, and on second thoughts he determined to take upon his own shoulders the responsibility of organizing some amusements, if the other councilmen would leave the matter in his hands. To this they quite readily agreed, the majority being fine old crusted characters who had a decided taste for living without worry. So Henchard set about his preparations for a really brilliant thing, such as should be worthy of the venerable town. As for Farfrae's little affair, Henchard nearly forgot it, except once now and then when, on it coming into his mind, he said to himself, "Charge admission at so much a head? Just like a Scotchman. Who is going to pay anything a head?" The diversions which the mayor intended to provide were to be entirely free. He had grown so dependent upon Donald that he could scarcely resist calling him in to consult, but by sheer self-coercion he refrained. No, he thought, Farfrae would be suggesting such improvements in his damned luminous way that in spite of himself he, Henchard, would sink to the position of second fiddle and only scrape harmonies to his manager's talents. Everybody applauded the mayor's proposed entertainment, especially when it became known that he meant to pay for it all himself. Close to the town was an elevated green spot, surrounded by an ancient square earthwork. Earthworks square and not square were as common as blackberries hereabout. A spot whereon the Casterbridge people usually held any kind of merrymaking, meeting, or sheep fair that required more space than the streets could afford. On one side it sloped to the river Froom, and from any point a view was obtained of the country round for many miles. This pleasant upland was to be the scene of Henchard's exploit. He advertised about the town in long posters of a pink colour that games of all sorts would take place here, and set to work a little battalion of men under his own eye. They erected greasy poles for climbing, with smoked hams and local cheeses at the top. They placed hurdles in rows for jumping over. Across the river they laid a slippery pole with a live pig of the neighbourhood tied at the other end, to become the property of the man who could walk over and get it. There were also provided wheelbarrows for racing, donkeys for the same, a stage for boxing, wrestling, and drawing blood generally, sacks for jumping in. Moreover, not forgetting his principles, Henchard provided a mammoth tea, of which everybody who lived in the borough was invited to partake without payment. The tables were laid parallel with the inner slope of the rampart, and awnings were stretched overhead. Passing to and fro, the mayor beheld the unattractive exterior of Farfrae's erection in the west walk, rick cloths of different sizes and colours being hung up to the arching trees without any regard to appearance. He was easy in his mind now, for his own preparations far transcended these. The morning came. The sky, which had been remarkably clear down to within a day or two, was overcast, and the weather threatening, the wind having an unmistakable hint of water in it. Henchard wished he had not been quite so sure about the continuance of a fair season, but it was too late to modify or postpone, and the proceedings went on. At 12 o'clock the rain began to fall, small and steady, commencing and increasing so insensibly that it was difficult to state exactly when dry weather ended or wet established itself. In an hour the slight moisture resolved itself into a monotonous smiting of earth by heaven, in torrents to which no end could be prognosticated. A number of people had heroically gathered in the field, but by 3 o'clock Henchard discerned that his project was doomed to end in failure. The hams at the top of the poles dripped watered smoke in the form of a brown liquor. The pig shivered in the wind. The grain of the deal tables showed through the sticking tablecloths, for the awning allowed the rain to drift under at its will, and to enclose the sides at this hour seemed a useless undertaking. The landscape over the river disappeared. The wind played on the tent cords in Aeolian improvisations, and at length rose to such a pitch that the whole erection slanted to the ground, those who had taken shelter within it having to crawl out on their hands and knees. But towards 6 the storm abated, and a drier breeze shook the moisture from the grass bents. It seemed possible to carry out the programme after all. The awning was set up again, the band was called out from its shelter and ordered to begin, and where the tables had stood a place was cleared for dancing. "But where are the folk?" said Henchard, after the lapse of half an hour, during which time only 2 men and a woman had stood up to dance. "The shops are all shut. Why don't they come?" "They are at Farfrae's affair in the West Walk," answered a councilman who stood in the field with the mayor. "A few, I suppose, but where are the body o' 'em?" "All out of doors are there." "Then the more fools they." Henchard walked away moodily. 1 or 2 young fellows gallantly came to climb the poles, to save the hams from being wasted. But as there were no spectators, and the whole scene presented the most melancholy appearance, Henchard gave orders that the proceedings were to be suspended and the entertainment closed, the food to be distributed among the poor people of the town. In a short time nothing was left in the field but a few hurdles, the tents, and the poles. Henchard returned to his house, had tea with his wife and daughter, and then walked out. It was now dusk. He soon saw that the tendency of all promenaders was towards a particular spot in the walks, and eventually proceeded thither himself. The notes of a stringed band came from the enclosure that Farfrae had erected, the pavilion as he called it, and when the mayor reached it he perceived that a gigantic tent had been ingeniously constructed without poles or ropes. The densest point of the avenue of sycamores had been selected, where the boughs made a closely interlaced vault overhead. To these boughs the canvas had been hung, and a barrel roof was the result. The end towards the wind was enclosed, the other end was open. Henchard went round and saw the interior. In form it was like the nave of a cathedral with one gable removed, but the scene within was anything but devotional. A reel or fling of some sort was in progress, and the usually sedate Farfrae was in the midst of the other dancers in the costume of a wild Highlander, flinging himself about and spinning to the tune. For a moment Henchard could not help laughing. Then he perceived the immense admiration for the Scotchman that revealed itself in the women's faces, and when this exhibition was over and a new dance proposed, and Donald had disappeared for a time to return in his natural garments, he had an unlimited choice of partners, every girl being in a coming-on disposition towards one who so thoroughly understood the poetry of motion as he. All the town crowded to the walk, such a delightful idea of a ballroom never having occurred to the inhabitants before. Among the rest of the onlookers were Elizabeth and her mother, the former thoughtful yet much interested, her eyes beaming with a longing, lingering light, as if nature had been advised by Correggio in their creation. The dancing progressed with unabated spirit, and Henchard walked and waited till his wife should be disposed to go home. He did not care to keep in the light, and when he went into the dark it was worse, for there he heard remarks of a kind which were becoming too frequent. "Mr. Henchard's rejoicings couldn't say good morning to this," said one. "A man must be a headstrong stun-pole to think folk would go up to that bleak place to-day." The other answered that people said it was not only in such things as those that the mayor was wanting. Where would his business be if it were not for this young fellow? 'Twas verily fortune sent him to Henchard. His accounts were like a bramblewood when Mr. Farfrae came. He used to reckon his sacks by chalk strokes all in a row like garden palings, measure his ricks by stretching with his arms, weigh his trusses by a lift, judge his hay by a chaw, and settle the price with a curse. But now this accomplished young man does it all by ciphering and mensuration. Then the wheat, that sometimes used to taste so strong o' mice when made into bread that people could fairly tell the breed. Farfrae has a plan for purifying, so that nobody would dream the smallest four-legged beast had walked over it once. Oh yes, everybody is full of him, and the care Mr. Henchard has to keep him, to be sure," concluded this gentleman. "But he won't do it for long, good now," said the other. "No," said Henchard to himself behind the tree, "or if he do, he'll be honeycombed clean out of all the character and standing that he's built up in these 18 year." He went back to the dancing pavilion. Farfrae was footing a quaint little dance with Elizabeth Jane, an old country thing, the only one she knew, and though he considerately toned down his movements to suit her demure gait, the pattern of the shining little nails in the soles of his boots became familiar to the eyes of every bystander. The tune had enticed her into it, being a tune of a busy, vaulting, leaping sort, some low notes on the silver string of each fiddle, then a skipping on the small, like running up and down ladders. Miss Milude of Ayr was its name, so Mr. Farfrae had said, and that it was very popular in his own country. It was soon over, and the girl looked at Henchard for approval, but he did not give it. He seemed not to see her. "Look here, Farfrae," he said, like one whose mind was elsewhere. "I'll go to Port Breedy Great Market to-morrow myself. You can stay and put things right in your clothes box, and recover strength to your knees after your vagaries." He planted on Donald an antagonistic glare that had begun as a smile. Some other townsmen came up, and Donald drew aside. "What's this, Henchard?" said Alderman Tubber, applying his thumb to the corn factor like a cheese taster. "An opposition randy to yours, eh? Jack's as good as his master, eh? Cut ye out quite, hasn't he?" "You see, Mr. Henchard," said the lawyer, another good-natured friend, "where you made the mistake was in going so far afield. You should have taken a leaf out of his book, and have had your sports in a sheltered place like this. But you didn't think of it, you see, and he did, and that's where he's beat you." "He'll be top sawyer soon of you two, and carry all afore him," added jocular Mr. Tubber. "No," said Henchard gloomily, "he won't be that, because he's shortly going to leave me." He looked towards Donald, who had come near. "Mr. Farfrae's time as my manager is drawing to a close, isn't it, Farfrae?" The young man, who could now read the lines and folds of Henchard's strongly traced face as if they were clear verbal inscriptions, quietly assented, and when people deplored the fact and asked why it was, he simply replied that Mr. Henchard no longer required his help. Henchard went home, apparently satisfied, but in the morning, when his jealous temper had passed away, his heart sank within him at what he had said and done. He was the more disturbed when he found that this time Farfrae was determined to take him at his word. End of chapter 16.